Being captured by Charles V, Francis I was forced to sign the Madrid Peace Treaty, which was unfavorable for himself, which involved the renunciation of France's claims to northern Italy, Flanders and Artois, as well as the transfer of Burgundy to Charles V. In addition, the sons of Francis I were to go to Spain as hostages. Charles V was very pleased with the concluded agreement, and as soon as the sons of the French king arrived in Spain, he immediately released Francis I to freedom. In turn, Francis I, having returned to his homeland, unexpectedly realized that his sons are not the most important thing in life, especially since their life at the Madrid court is most likely not in danger, but the loss of Burgundy will adversely affect the income of France, as well as prestige French monarchy. That is why Francis I categorically refused to comply with the terms of the Madrid Treaty. The decision of Francis was supported by Pope Clement VII, who, fearing the growth of the influence of Charles V in Italy, broke off the alliance with him. Francis decided to take advantage of the favorable situation, and in 1526 an alliance was created in the city of Cognac against Charles V, which, in addition to the Pope and Francis I, included Florence, the Duchy of Milan and the Venetian Republic, who did not like the presence of Spanish troops in Italy, as well as England, which was cautious watched the rapid growth of the power of Charles V. In addition, the French managed to enlist the support of the Genoese fleet. The first blow was delivered by the troops of the League of Cognac. They attacked the city of Lodi, which belonged to Spain, and, as a result of a swift assault, captured it. The Allies failed to build on the initial success. The fact is that the army hastily assembled by Charles V was able not only to dislodge the Allies from Lodi, but also to establish control over the entire Duchy of Milan, forcing the Duke of Milan, Francesco Sforza, to give up his possessions. While the army of Charles V was establishing control over the Duchy of Milan, the Cognac League was attacked by the emperor's allies from the Italian family Colonna. Taking advantage of the fact that the troops of Clement VII were concentrated in northern Italy, the army of the Colonna invaded the boundaries of the Papal State and occupied Rome almost without meeting any resistance. The joy of victory was not long, since very soon papal detachments were gathered in the vicinity of Rome, which defeated the army of the Colonna and liberated the city. Despite the successful liberation of Rome, events did not develop in favor of the Pope. The fact is that in April 1527 an uprising broke out in Florence against the Medici family. And since the Pope himself came from this family, he was forced to send troops to suppress this uprising. At this time, Charles V was gathering a new Landsknecht army, which, having united with the Spanish detachments led by Charles de Bourbon, began to move towards Rome. Since at that time the troops of the Pope were busy suppressing the uprising in Florence, the imperial army, without meeting resistance, reached Rome and laid siege to the city. As is often the case, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire ran out of money at the most inopportune moment, and the mercenaries were left without a salary. In a normal situation, Landsknechts, without receiving a salary, would simply return home, robbing all the settlements along the way. But since they were in the vicinity of Rome, which was famous for its wealth, Landsknechts and Italian mercenaries continued the siege. During the siege, a lucky shooter was found on the city walls, who killed Charles de Bourbon with a well-aimed shot. The death of the commander caused real anarchy in the imperial camp. The Landsknechts ceased to obey any orders, but at the same time began to besiege the city even more fiercely. On May 6, 1527, the Imperials managed to capture the city, in which massacre and robbery immediately began. The city was completely devastated, and the Pope managed to take refuge in the castle of the Holy Angel. In early June 1527, Detachments that remained loyal to the Pope gathered in the vicinity of Rome. But the mercenaries who captured the city did not plan to simply release the Pope or leave the city. Fortunately, the mercenaries were quite pragmatic people, so they agreed to leave the city and return home in exchange for a huge ransom of 400,000 ducats. After the ruin of Rome, the Pope actually withdrew from the League of Cognac, which forced the French to take action. Since Francis I was afraid to engage in confrontation with Charles V alone, he agreed on joint actions with the English King Henry VIII, after which he began to prepare a campaign against Naples in order to deprive the Spaniards of the main base in Italy. So getting to Naples by land was long, and because there was a high probability of not reaching the city, to face the imperial army in northern Italy, Francis decided on a cunning maneuver. His army reached Genoa, after which, with the help of the allied Genoese fleet, it was delivered to the vicinity of Naples. Already in April 1528, the French army under the command of Aude de Foix began the siege of Naples. At the same time, the 8,000-strong French army under the command of François de Bourbon invaded the territory of the Duchy of Milan. Having broken the resistance of the imperial garrisons, the French army occupied the city of Novara, and after some time it reached the outskirts of Pavia. The siege of Pavia lasted only a few days, after which the city's garrison decided to capitulate. Since the French army was small, it was in no hurry to advance on the capital of the duchy, the city of Milan. Francis's plan was quite simple, yet effective. The fact is that the presence of the French army in Lombardy did not allow Charles V to send all available forces to lift the siege of Naples. As for Henry VIII, he decided not to rush to start hostilities against the Spaniards, but first to observe the successes of the French and, as time showed, he was right. Initially, Francis's plan worked flawlessly, but the problem was that he overestimated his generosity or underestimated the greed of the Genoese. Very soon after the beginning of the siege of Naples, the commander of the Genoese fleet, Andrea Doria, decided that Francis was paying him too little. He went over to the side of Charles V and, having led the rebellion, managed to oust all French troops from the Republic of Genoa. Immediately after this, the successful siege of Naples became a failure. The fact is that the supply of the French army was carried out by the forces of the Genoese fleet, and therefore, after the betrayal of the Genoese, the French began to experience problems with food. The problems didn't end there. An epidemic of plague began in the French camp, which claimed the lives of a huge number of soldiers, including Commander Aude de Foix. Having lost their commander, the remnants of the French army tried to get to the north of Italy, but were overtaken by Spanish troops. Thus, the French army that besieged Naples was partially destroyed and partially dispersed. After the defeat of the main army, the French had only a small army in Italy under the command of François de Bourbon, who was located near the village of Landriano. Since de Bourbon did not know that the main French army was defeated, he did not expect an attack by imperial troops, which caused him to lose his vigilance. At this time, the imperial troops under the command of Antonio de Leyva began to move towards Landriano. Despite the numerical advantage, the Imperials, in order to guarantee their victory, decided to attack the enemy unexpectedly. On June 21, 1529, the imperial detachments, without the usual drumming, approached the positions of the French troops in the vicinity of Landriano. Since de Bourbon lost his vigilance, he poorly organized patrols, which allowed the Imperials to approach the positions of the French troops undetected. The reserve of the French army, which was personally commanded by de Bourbon, was located away from the main French army, and the Imperials took advantage of this. The swift attack of the Imperial cavalry took de Bourbon by surprise. His people not only failed to meet the enemy with a counterattack, but also retreated to their main forces. Very soon the reserve of the French army was surrounded. For some time the French resisted, but after suffering serious losses, the French reserve was forced to surrender, and de Bourbon was captured. The news of the capture of de Bourbon greatly undermined the morale of the French infantry. At this time, she came under heavy artillery fire and was attacked by the Spanish infantry. A bloody battle ensued. Despite the numerical superiority of the enemy, the French tried to hold their position. In turn, the nearby French cavalry tried to save their infantry by attacking the flank of the enemy infantry. The maneuver of the French cavalry came as no surprise to the Spaniards. Never reaching the ranks of the Spanish infantry, the French cavalry was attacked by the Imperial horsemen. After some time, the French cavalry was overturned and hastily left the battlefield. All this time, the French infantry resisted fiercely, but after the attack of the Imperial cavalry, they faltered and tried to flee. Only a small part of the French were able to leave the battlefield. Having received news of the death of two of his armies, Francis I realized that he would not be able to quickly restore his strength. Therefore, on August 5, 1529, he was forced to make peace on the terms of Charles V. France renounced claims to northern Italy, Flanders and Artois, and Charles V, in turn, renounced claims to Burgundy. Francis also paid a ransom for his sons in the amount of 2 million écus, after which they returned home. After France withdrew from the war, the only opponents of Charles V in Italy remained the Republic of Florence. At this time, the Pope, who after the ruin of Rome again became an ally of Charles V, was thinking about how to return the Republic of Florence under his rule. Charles V agreed to help the Pope in exchange for a promise to crown him Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in Bologna. On October 24, 1529, the imperial army laid siege to Florence. The city was well prepared for the siege and did not plan to surrender. The siege went on for quite some time. After some time, food problems and diseases began in the city. Watching all this, the commander of the Florence garrison, Francesco Ferrucci, realized that money is much better than death from starvation or disease, so he negotiated with the Imperials. On August 8, 1530, he openly went over to the side of Charles V. Francesco Ferrucci's men turned their cannons towards the city and opened the gates to the Imperials. Soon the Imperials transferred power over the city to the Pope, who appointed his illegitimate son Alessandro as head of the Republic of Florence. 2 years later, in 1532, the Republic of Florence was transformed into a duchy, and Alessandro received the title of Duke. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Let's explore history together.